Welcome back to Bookcast, where we cover bestsellers in minutes. Today we're going to be diving deep into Memorial Days,
Okay.
the latest memoir from Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Geraldine Brooks.
Right.
It's a really profoundly personal exploration of grief and loss
Yeah.
and resilience.
hmm
And it's centered around the sudden death of her husband, Tony Horwitz, who was himself
Right.
an acclaimed author and journalist.
Yes. What makes this book so captivating, I think, is that it goes beyond just recounting the events.
Right.
Brooks provides this really raw and honest look at her grieving process,
Yeah.
and she does it while layering in these fascinating glimpses into different cultural approaches to mourning.
And we're lucky enough to have excerpts from the book itself.
Yes.
So we'll be sharing some of Brooks's most powerful and insightful passages with you today,
Great.
offering intimate access to her journey
Yeah.
as she grapples with this immense loss.
One of the things that struck me as I was reading this was how Brooks weaves her personal reckoning with loss against this backdrop of global tragedies. She lost Tony in 2019, just before the COVID-19 pandemic hit,
Oh, wow.
adding another layer of complexity to her grieving process.
Yeah, that's incredible to think about that timing.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's jump right into the heart of the story.
Yeah.
Brooks is on Martha's Vineyard. It's Memorial Day weekend.
Right.
And she receives this shocking phone call that changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
Tony, who was on a book tour in Washington, D.C., has died.
Right.
Can you talk about the immediacy of that moment and the way Brooks captures that initial shock?
Yeah, so the book opens with this real gut punch.
Okay.
You're right there with Brooks as she receives the news, and it's like the air gets sucked out of the room.
Yeah.
She keeps repeating, "No, not Tony, not him."
Oh, wow.
This desperate attempt to deny the reality of what she's just been told.
That detail, the repetition of that phrase is so powerful.
Right.
It really conveys that disbelief and the struggle to process such a sudden and unexpected loss.
Absolutely. And what makes it even more heartbreaking is the way the doctor delivers the news.
Okay.
Brooks describes him as abrupt and detached,
Wow.
which just amplifies the feeling of shock and disconnect.
Right.
She's thrust into this whirlwind of emotions,
Yeah.
and there's no one offering comfort or guidance.
And if that wasn't difficult enough,
Right.
she's then faced with this logistical nightmare
Yes.
of being stranded on Martha's Vineyard during a holiday weekend,
Yep.
unable to immediately get to Tony.
Right, and this is where we see the first hint of what becomes a recurring theme in the book.
Okay.
This frustrating bureaucracy of death.
Oh, wow.
Brooks talks about needing to identify Tony's body, but only being allowed to do so from a photograph.
Oh, gosh.
Later, she faces legal hurdles in being recognized as the rightful guardian of their adopted son, Bizu.
So it's almost like she's thrown into this absurd obstacle course.
Yeah.
On top of the emotional turmoil,
Right.
she's grappling with the loss of her husband and simultaneously battling paperwork and legal complexities.
It's a stark reminder that even in the face of profound personal grief,
Right.
the world keeps spinning.
Yeah.
Life, with all its demands and absurdities, continues, often at odds with the inner turmoil we're experiencing.
So as Brooks navigates this initial shock and the logistical hurdles, she decides to escape to a remote shack on Flinders Island,
Okay.
off the coast of Tasmania.
So Flinders Island holds a special significance for Brooks. It's a place of stark beauty,
Right.
this raw landscape where she and Tony had visited years earlier.
Right.
It's remote, isolated, and deeply connected to the natural world,
Yeah.
which becomes a source of solace for Brooks.
So it sounds like the island becomes a sanctuary for her,
Exactly.
the place where she can finally confront the full weight of her grief without distractions.
She describes it as a space where she can shed the need to perform to pretend everything is okay.
Yeah.
On Flinders Island, she allows herself to fully inhabit her grief.
And it's here in this isolated environment that the book takes this truly fascinating turn. As Brooks immerses herself in the solitude of Flinders Island,
Right.
she starts to explore the diverse ways different cultures approach mourning.
Yes. We see Brooks grappling with the Jewish tradition of Shiva,
Okay.
the extended mourning periods observed by Aboriginal communities, and the Islamic practice of Ida.
Okay.
She contrasts these rituals with her own internal struggle to find meaning in Tony's absence.
Yeah.
What's striking is how she inadvertently finds herself engaging with some of these traditions,
Right.
even though she doesn't consciously intend to.
It's as if on a subconscious level, she's seeking a framework for her grief,
Yeah.
a way to channel the overwhelming emotions she's experiencing.
And this exploration of different mourning rituals isn't just an intellectual exercise for Brooks.
Okay.
It becomes deeply personal.
Yeah.
She talks about feeling drawn to the Jewish tradition of Shiva, even though she doesn't identify as Jewish. And she finds comfort in the Aboriginal concept of carrying the spirit of the deceased with you.
So it seems that in exploring these traditions, she's searching for a way to honor Tony's memory while also finding her own individual path through grief.
Right, and this is where the book moves beyond a personal memoir and becomes a broader reflection on how we as humans make sense of loss and find meaning in the face of death.
So while Brooks is wrestling with her own grief on Flinders Island, we also get this fascinating window into Tony's life and legacy.
Brooks masterfully interweaves personal anecdotes with excerpts from obituaries, painting a vibrant picture of Tony's personality and the impact he had as a journalist and historian. We learn about his humor, his passion for uncovering hidden truths, and his unique ability to connect with people from all walks of life.
I was struck by the moment Brooks reflects on some of Tony's early journal entries.
Oh, yeah.
They're filled with self-doubt about his writing career. It's a poignant reminder that even the most successful people often struggle with insecurity.
It adds a layer of humanity to his success.
Yeah.
Knowing he had to overcome these internal hurdles makes his accomplishments even more meaningful.
Right.
And it also speaks to Brooks's deep understanding of him. She saw his vulnerabilities, his struggles, as well as his triumphs.
And that brings us to their relationship.
Yes.
The book offers these tender glimpses into their 35-year marriage, highlighting their deep connection and mutual respect.
They were each other's biggest champions.
Yeah.
But Brooks is honest about the challenges of balancing their individual ambitions with their life as a couple. She craved downtime and relaxation, while Tony was all in all the time on his work.
That difference in temperament really jumps out.
Yeah.
Brooks talks about Tony's reliance on alcohol and caffeine to fuel his writing process, even when she expressed concerns about his health.
And this unfortunately foreshadows the mystery that will unfold regarding Tony's death. Initially attributed to a heart attack, it's later revealed that something else was at play.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You mentioned earlier that Brooks layers her personal grief against the backdrop of global events.
Right.
How does this play out as she begins to understand the true nature of Tony's death?
Well, remember, she loses Tony in 2019 just before the COVID-19 pandemic explodes onto the world stage. As she delves into the medical details. It turns out Tony didn't die of a typical heart attack. He had myocarditis.
Oh, wow.
A rare inflammatory heart condition.
Wow.
Often triggered by a virus. It's often a silent condition, meaning there can be very few warning signs.
Wow.
And it's particularly dangerous for young, healthy people, which makes Tony's case all the more tragic.
It's this added layer of complexity and almost cruel irony, isn't it? Here we have this global pandemic about to unfold, a virus wreaking havoc on the world, and it turns out a virus might have played a role in Tony's death, too.
Exactly. Brooks even reflects on this in the book, how this invisible enemy took her husband before the world truly understood the scale of the threat.
This revelation must have been just devastating for Brooks. Not only is she grappling with the loss, but now she's faced with the guilt of potentially missing warning signs.
Absolutely. Brooks is incredibly candid about the guilt she carries. She recounts moments where Tony complained of shortness of breath, a key symptom of myocarditis. But he brushed it off his exertion and delayed seeking medical attention due to his busy book tour schedule.
It's that hindsight, isn't it? Looking back and wondering, what if? It's a heavy burden to bear.
And it raises important questions about how we prioritize our health, especially when we're driven by passion and ambition. It's easy to dismiss symptoms, telling ourselves, we'll deal with them later. But as Tony's story tragically illustrates, sometimes later never comes.
It's a harsh lesson for sure. So Brooks is on Flinders Island, processing this immense loss, coming to terms with the true nature of Tony's death, and then she's hit with another blow. The pandemic forces her to leave the island and return to the United States.
It's like she's being pulled away from the sanctuary. She's found this place where she was starting to make sense of her grief, and she's thrust back into a world that's grappling with its own collective trauma.
It must have felt like losing Tony all over again in a way.
There's definitely a sense of that in the book, but it's also during this time as she's navigating the early days of the pandemic that Brooks finds solace in an unexpected source. nature.
She'd already been drawn to the natural world on Flinders Island, finding comfort in its raw beauty.
Right. And back in the States, she continues to seek solace in nature, taking long walks, observing the changing seasons, and finding comfort in the cycles of life and death that are all around us.
It's a reminder that even in the midst of loss and uncertainty, nature endures.
Right.
There's a resilience there that can be incredibly grounding.
And for Brooks, this connection to nature becomes a turning point. She decides to embrace her writing as a way to honor Tony's memory and to find meaning in the midst of loss.
It's this powerful act of transformation. She channels her grief into creativity, drawing strength from the very thing she and Tony shared, a love of words and storytelling.
She even recalls advice from the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who had also experienced the loss of her husband. Ginsburg told her, "Do your work. It might not be your best work, but it will be good work. And it will be what saves you."
And that's exactly what Brooks does. She throws herself back into writing, finishing her novel Horse, a project she'd been struggling with before Tony's death.
Right.
It's a testament to her resilience and her commitment to honoring Tony's legacy by continuing the work they both loved.
And as she's writing, she's also reflecting on their life together, the joys and the challenges of their shared careers as writers.
I love how the book gives us these intimate glimpses into their dynamic as a couple.
Yes.
For example, Brooks talks about Tony's obsession with finance and how he even drafted a proposal for a book about it called October Eggs.
Wow.
Inspired by one of his grandfather's favorite investments.
It's these little details that bring Tony to life. We see his quirks, his passions, his unique way of looking at the world.
And it highlights their differences too.
Yeah.
Brooks is much more cautious, while Tony embraced risk, both in his writing and in his personal life.
They complemented each other beautifully. Yeah. They had different strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
But their mutual respect and support shines through, even in the midst of disagreements.
Okay, but let's pause here for a moment. You and I both know this deep dive is part of Bookcast,
right?
A show that prides itself on covering bestsellers in minutes. We're already a good chunk of the way through, and we still have so much to unpack. How do we ensure we're doing justice to both the depth of the book and the time constraints of our listeners?
That's a great question. I think what's important to remember is that Memorial Days is both a profoundly personal story and a universal exploration of grief, loss, and resilience.
Yeah.
So even as we condense the narrative, those core themes will resonate with our listener.
You're right. And we're focusing on the most impactful moments.
Right.
The insights that will stay with our listeners long after they've finished this episode.
We're also encouraging our listeners to dive into the source material themselves.
Yeah.
Consider this a starting point, a roadmap to the most meaningful aspects of the book.
So with that in mind, let's continue our exploration. One of the most poignant sections of the book is when Brooks describes attending Tony's memorial service on Martha's Vineyard.
Okay.
In that small town of Chilmark they both loved.
It's a beautiful and heartbreaking scene. We see this outpouring of love and respect from friends, family, and colleagues.
Yeah.
They share stories and tributes that capture the essence of Tony's life and the impact he had on those around him.
One eulogy that particularly stands out is from a friend who talks about Tony's ability to disarm people.
Oh, yeah.
To get them to open up and share their stories, even in a world that's often guarded and suspicious.
It speaks to his genuine curiosity and his ability to connect with people from all walks of life.
Yeah.
And it's a quality that shines through in his writing as well. His books are filled with these intimate portraits of ordinary people grappling with extraordinary circumstances.
There's also a really powerful moment where Brooks's nephew sings Bob Dylan's Forever Young in Tony's honor.
It's a perfect choice. A song that captures both the sadness of loss and the enduring nature of love and memory.
The book doesn't shy away from the rawness of grief either.
No, it doesn't.
Brooks is honest about the emotional roller coaster, the moments of anger and despair, alongside the tenderness and gratitude.
There's a particularly raw section where she talks about her fury at the cancellation of their health insurance just days after Tony's death.
It's a stark reminder of the absurdities of the system. Even in the midst of this profound personal loss,
right,
the bureaucratic machinery keeps grinding, often with little regard for human suffering.
And it highlights the privilege Brooks has as a well-connected writer. Right. To navigate those systems and ultimately get the coverage reinstated.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what happens to those who don't have those resources or connections.
It's a sobering thought. So Brooks is back in the States, grappling with her grief,
Right.
navigating a world in the throes of a pandemic.
Yeah.
And she's also bombarded with these condolence notes. She talks about feeling overwhelmed by the sheer volume of them.
She appreciates the outpouring of support.
Right.
But it also becomes this burden, this impossible task of responding to each expression of sympathy while simultaneously trying to piece her life back together.
It's a feeling many of us can relate to, that sense of being both comforted and suffocated by the rituals and expectations surrounding death.
And it speaks to the importance of finding our own ways to grieve, to honor the memory of those we've lost, while also creating space for our own healing and growth.
So as Memorial Days draws to a close, Brooks reflects on the lessons she's learned.
Right.
The ways in which her experience of grief has transformed her.
She talks about the importance of finding solace in nature, of connecting with those cycles of life and death that are all around us. And she emphasizes the power of writing, of using words to make sense of the world, to honor memory, and to forge a path forward.
And there's this beautiful and poignant moment where she describes scattering Tony's ashes in his baseball mitt.
Oh, wow.
Fulfilling his wish to be laid to rest in the scruffy, chill-mark softball field he loves so much.
It's the perfect tribute, a gesture that captures Tony's unique spirit and his connection to that island community. But before we move on to the final takeaways from this book, let's circle back to that issue of time. We're trying to provide the key insights of this bestseller in just minutes, and I want to assure our listeners that we're aware of their time. We're about to wrap up this deep dive with Brooks's most powerful piece of advice from this book, which I think perfectly exemplifies why this book is worth your time.
So what is it? What's that advice?
Brooks encourages everyone to create a document titled Your Life, How It Works, and to keep it updated.
Oh, wow. It sounds incredibly practical and honestly a bit daunting. I'm not sure I want to think about that.
It's definitely a sobering thought, but think of it this way. It's an act of love for those you leave behind. By taking the time to organize your affairs, to make your wishes known, you can ease the burden on your loved ones during a time when they'll already be overwhelmed with grief.
You're absolutely right. I hadn't thought about it that way. Thinking back to Brooks's experience with all those logistical hurdles after Tony's death, having that document in place would have made things so much easier for her.
Exactly. Brooks admits that she and Tony weren't always the best at this kind of practical planning.
Right.
And she wishes she'd had a clearer understanding of their finances, legal documents, and other essential information. It's a reminder that even in the midst of love and shared dreams, it's important to address the practicalities of life and death.
It's not about being morbid. It's about being responsible. It's about taking care of those we love even in our absence. And this brings us to the heart of Memorial Days. It's a book about love loss and the enduring power of memory. It's about finding meaning in the midst of tragedy and embracing the messy, unpredictable nature of life and death. It's also a reminder that grief has no timeline and that there's no right or wrong way to mourn.
Absolutely.
Healing is a process, not a destination.
There's a quote from novelist Yi-Yun Lee that Brooks mentions, which really resonated with me. The predicament when writing about a sudden, untimely death, the more you remember, the more elusive that death becomes.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like the harder you try to grasp the reality of the loss, the more it slips away.
But Brooks also talks about the importance of reliving the trauma, of returning to those painful memories again and again as a way to process the grief and ultimately find a path towards healing.
So it's not about trying to forget or to bury the pain, but rather to confront it, to work through it.
Exactly. And Memorial Days is a testament to that process. Brooks's writing is so raw and insightful, vulnerable and courageous. She doesn't offer easy answers or platitudes, but rather a deeply personal and universally relatable journey through grief.
So why should our listeners care about this book? What makes it worth their time, especially given our bestsellers in minutes format?
Because loss is an inevitable part of life, and understanding how others navigate that experience can offer us valuable insights and tools for our own journeys. Memorial Days is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's beauty to be found, connections to be made, and stories to be told. It's a book that invites us to embrace the full spectrum of human experience, the joy and the sorrow, the love and the loss, and to find meaning in the midst of it all.
And hopefully it inspires our listeners to have those difficult conversations with loved ones, to get their affairs in order, and to cherish each day.
As Tony's story so poignantly illustrates, life is fragile and unpredictable. We can't always control what happens, but we can choose how we respond, how we grieve, and how we carry on.
And for those who do choose to read this book after listening to our deep dive, Brooks leaves us with one final thought-provoking question. She talks about carrying Tony's light, keeping his memory alive for their sons and future generations. What does it mean to carry the light of those we've lost? How do we honor their legacies while also forging our own paths forward?
It's a powerful question, and one that I think each of us must answer in our own way.
And that's it for our deep dive into Memorial Days on Bookcast Bestsellers in Minutes. Thanks for joining us.